Well, welcome everybody to SchellmanCON, and thank you for attending our talk. And let's get right into it. So today we are talking identity Linkin Logs, low play on words, but how to build cloud environments like it's child's play. So let's go into what that is and who we are. So what we're going to talk about today is a few things. We're going to introduce ourselves, tell you who we are, why at least we should be talking about this so that you actually know how we're qualified. We're going to run through identity management and compliance, how those work together, what you need to be doing for identity management. This will be a little bit high level, and then we're going to start steadily getting a little bit deeper as we go into organizational structure, single sign-on, and identity and access management. And towards the end, we're actually going to show you a little bit of code. And we only have about 40 minutes to talk, so we're not going to go super deep, but there will be a Q&A at the end where you can ask us questions. So first off, who are we? So I'm going to start with myself. I'm Greg Peterson. I have been with ScaleSec for about 4 years. I'm a principal cloud security consultant. I have done security for about 25 years now. Spent about the last 8 to 10 years just focusing on cloud. And Aaron, do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Thanks, Greg. I'm Aaron Ray. I'm also principal here at ScaleSec. Been with the company about 6.5 years, and prior to that, I was automating things at a couple of startups, a couple of large MSPs, and some other consultancies.
Perfect. Thank you, Aaron. All right. So who are we? Why should you listen to us? We are ScaleSec. We're a small boutique cloud security and compliance company. We have just a ton of experience. We have between all of us, well over 100 certs, AWS, GCP, Azure, industry certs around security, and just decades on decades of experience in this area. What are we trying to tell you or show you with this particular presentation? Today, we're going to run through the importance of proper identity management. What is identity management? Why you need to focus on it? And this will be a little high level. We're going to start getting into lessons learned. We deal with dozens upon dozens of clients every year. We've done tons of different identity work, and we've learned things that do work and things that don't work. We're going to actually try to give you a little bit of that knowledge so that in the future, you don't make decisions that cause pain. We want to remove fear and uncertainty on using cloud identity and how cloud identity will tie into all your other identities, whether it's on-premise or if you're using third parties. And then finally, we're going to have that Q&A at the end where you can ask us questions, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time allotted. So let's start with identity management and compliance. So identity management, what is it? It is basically a way to ensure that your users have the appropriate access to the systems they need. So users can be people, users can be systems or applications. You want to be sure that whoever is being granted access to a system has the proper permissions set up so that they do not get access to things they do not need. This is a security best practice. Any security framework, governance framework, compliance framework, which we'll talk about in a minute, covers identity. Identity is a key portion. You need to focus on it, not just creating accounts. You generally have to have a strategy, and we're going to talk through strategy as part of this. When you start getting into cloud is a little bit different than on-premise because in cloud, everything is an API. It's an application programming interface that you actually have to authenticate to when you're working your way into the cloud. Identity therefore becomes one of the key, if not the key strategy when you're working in the cloud environments, is having solid identity set up and access control around that. Even when you use a SaaS solution, so let's say you use Salesforce. Salesforce is running the back end. They run the servers, they run their operating system, their databases, they run that. You are just given access into their software. Your main control as a SaaS user is through your identity management. Identity management is key, and and we actually propose, or we're a big proponent of this, is pushing people more to a SaaS solution where it makes sense, because you're moving a lot of the burden of maintaining the operating system, databases, and everything else to a third party, and you can focus on how the application works. What are some of the concerns that people have when we actually go into a cloud environment and identity management. Complexity. Complexity is a big deal. When you come in, you can have a very decentralized environment. You can have 12, 14, 15 different systems that have their own identities. It could be databases, different applications, third parties that you're getting into. If you're in 3 clouds, you may have 3 different identities set up, one for each cloud. That's a very decentralized solution. A centralized solution is helping tie many or all of those into one solution where it's easier to manage. We're going to talk about that as we go into this. Then another concern is management. Management of your overall identities has lots of different areas you can focus on, but I'm going to talk about a couple here. Least privilege. You want to ensure that whoever is granted access has the least amount of access they need to perform whatever their job functions are. How does this help? This means that if anybody's credentials are compromised, which is a big deal, that happens all the time, that they can generally not get to everything in your system. If you have somebody that just runs reports for you on a daily basis and you give them admin rights, and for some reason they click on a phishing link and their credentials are compromised, they now have admin rights. If it's into your cloud environment, they now have access into everything that you have in the cloud. You need to ensure that the people that don't have need for any sort of access do not have the access granted to them. And the reviews. When you're doing management, you need to go through and you need to review who has access on a periodic basis. I'd say almost everything I look at says that quarterly is the best practice. You define what your periodic rotation is, but at that point, you want to do reviews to ensure that people that have access should have the access, people that have access are still employed. Aaron and I go to a lot of different companies, and when we go in the first time into their environments, we will see user accounts for people that haven't worked there for 3, 4, or 5 years. And we will ask why they're there. Why haven't those accounts been removed? Because in theory, if you have a ex-employee that suddenly gets upset, they may go in there and do something, or they could have credentials that could be compromised. And then finally, one of the big concerns around identity management is user experience. So I mentioned before, in a very decentralized system, you can have 12 distinct IDs, user IDs and passwords for your employees. And they will start making bad decisions. They will start reusing passwords. They will start writing them down. There's a lot of different concerns that could happen. By using a centralized system, you can increase the user experience where they actually only have 1 or maybe 2 to keep track of. So let's take that on into compliance. How does compliance deal with identity? I spend a lot of time in compliance. I head up our compliance practice. Almost all compliance frameworks have a good portion of their controls around identity. Identity is key to most compliance frameworks. Any security strategy, as I mentioned before, is gonna have identity management in it. Almost every framework you're gonna look at has different specific rules on identity. There's way too many to list here, so I went through some examples and I just wanted to highlight a few different areas that are common across a lot of the frameworks you look at. So common frameworks, ISO. ISO is a European-based organization that provides guidance globally. And one of them is 27001. That's around an information security management system. And one of the controls is stating that the full lifecycle of identity should be managed. What's a lifecycle of an identity? This is from when an identity is created to when it is changed over time, to the final point where you delete or terminate an identity. That is the life cycle of an identity. The entire process has to be managed. If you're going for ISO certification, you need that. PCI DSS, that's a PCI data security standard. If you're processing or accepting credit cards, you have to follow this. One of their controls says all users are assigned a unique ID for any systems they access. This is another key component of identity management. Unique IDs can associate activities to a user. Shared IDs, and we see this in a lot of places where they have a shared admin account or something else that actually has privileged access, that cannot properly be attributed to a user that makes a change. If there's 5 people that have access to the password, it's very hard to attribute one of those persons with changes that happen. You really do not want to use shared IDs. There's hardly ever a good example. And if there is a good example of one, let's say a break glass account that you have to use, you would then have access controls around getting to the actual password where you could know who actually had it at that point. Another standard out there, NIST. NIST is a US organization, US government organization that creates standards. They have one, SP 853. This is around information security, and it's used in all sorts of different regulations. If you do FedRAMP, FedRAMP's going to take a subset of all the 853 controls. It's used all over. If you use NIST CSF, it's going to pull from 853. And a lot of frameworks will at least give you a mapping, and they'll tie back into 853 to show you how to work. So this is a very popular standard. This control says employ the least privileged principle. This is key. Once again, I talked about earlier, so I'm not going to delve deeper into it. But you want to be sure at all times, whoever has the least amount or whoever has privileges, they are limited to what they need for their job function. If their job function changes, you should have a process in place that says, okay, I'm moving from a role where I need admin to another role where I no longer need admin. That should therefore update my identity and the access control around it. And the final one, I'm just going to jump back to ISO 27001. This one is basically stating, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, but anything around access rights should be provisioned, reviewed, modified, and removed in accordance to your policy. This is an overarching thing we're going to talk about in a minute, but your policy should cover identity management. Identity management could be its own policy. It could be part of your just overarching information security management policy. It could be part of your access control policy. You need a policy that covers all your information management, or it could be tied into multiple policies. I've seen it that way as well. So let's talk about some points of focus around identity management. So I have acronym soup on the right here. There's lots of acronyms around this, but we're going to kind of break these down real quick. The first thing is that overarching policy. You need to define at a high level what you're doing around identity management. It can define your least privilege. It can define how you go through and bring in new identity solutions. There's lots of things you can put in your identity management policy, but you really do need a policy to start. We've seen companies that have 12 distinct areas or 6 distinct areas, and they're all following their own different process around identity because they use different systems. They don't have a centralized identity provider. This becomes very difficult to maintain and almost, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's very difficult to go to your customers when they ask you to prove their security and you come back with 6 distinct processes for identity management. That is generally not best practices, and it's going to raise a lot of flags. Once you have this policy, you need to decide on an access control strategy. So we're going to cover a bunch of acronyms here, but we have role-based access control, and we're going to delve deeper into this towards the end. Role-based access control is what most people are used to. So as opposed to myself, Greg, being given specific rights, instead, Greg will be added to a role. It could be admin, it could be developer, it could be engineer. I'm basically assigned to a role that has permissions. So if I leave the company or if I do anything or I move, they just move me, Greg, from whatever role I'm in into another role, as opposed to having to go through all of my permissions and figure out which ones apply to my new role. That's the most common. We also have attribute-based access control. So what's an attribute? So in cloud, and we are focusing more on cloud here, in cloud, that could be a label or a tag that's associated with something. And so you could go through and state, if this particular attribute, this tag, this label is set, then this is the permissions you get. And then finally, we have policy-based access control, and we'll cover that a little bit, but basically the policy defines your access control. So it's not based off your role or a particular attribute, it's based off a policy. And once again, we're going to cover that towards the end of this. So that's RBAC, ABAC, and PBAC. But we also have organizational structure, which is the point of focus here. Organizational structure is really around a few things, but your identity provider, your IDP, is very important. This is who is your store of your identities. Most companies try to get centralized where they have one. So an example would be Okta or Entra ID, which is Azure AD or Active Directory at one point. Those are identity providers. You need to have some sort of structure on who your identity providers are. You need to determine how you're going to set up MFA, multi-factor authentication. By default, in almost every security standard, if you have external access into your environment, so it could be from the internet or third parties, you need MFA set up. Best practice for pretty much everything else is do it internally to your systems as well, especially for privileged accounts. Because one of the most common ways for compromises and breaches to happen is stolen credentials. And MFA will help make that much more difficult, if not outright block it. Finally, identity management procedures. You need to have procedures. You need to actually have consistent procedures that are followed by your different departments. It could be your IT support desk, help desk, whoever's. You could have SAs. They're setting up accounts. But they need to define your moves, your adds, your changes, your MAC, your reviews. You need to set regular reviews, and it should be done by people that actually know who needs access to what. I worked at a big bank for a long time, and every quarter I would get an email and I would have to go through all my employees and see every system they had access to and click if they still needed that access or not. And that was many hours of my day when that came out. But it was useful because I actually knew who had access to what, and we can prove that we actually manage this on a quarterly basis. Okay, so what I'm going to do is hand it over to Aaron, and Aaron's going to run through these. I'm going to jump in as needed, but Aaron, you have the rest of the slides.
All right, thank you, Greg. So we've got three other sections here we're going to go through. The first one being setting up your organizational structure. So we'll start by talking about how to design your organization, and then go into a little bit about what a sound design actually enables you to do. And then we'll talk about single sign-on, which you would layer on top of the organization. And then finally, we'll give some examples of some fancy things you can do with IAM once you are actually using all the features down below that. So like I said, before we can talk about effectively scaling IAM in general, we need to set a foundation for scaling the cloud infrastructure and the organization around all the resources and all the projects and so forth. And now each cloud has their own parlance and a lot of nuance around how you define the organizational structure, but generally it boils down to kind of a 4-level hierarchy. At the most atomic level, you have the individual cloud resources. This could be a bucket, a compute instance, a Kubernetes cluster, or a messaging queue, etc. And you would group those logically into an account. So maybe a single application has a number of resources that you would want to segment into a specific account. Now, when you get multiple applications and they each have their own account, and maybe they're all under one dev team or one business unit, you would further group those at kind of a mid-level. And in each of the cloud's parlances, this is for AWS, for example, this is an organizational unit or an OU. In GCP, they call it a folder, which is probably the most reasonable thing to call it. Azure, they call it a group. And then above that is really the highest level of organization, which is really singular. It's the root level of that organization. AWS and GCP just call it an organization. Azure calls it the tenant root. But the design of this hierarchy is critical, because each platform allows you to apply various blanket policies at different levels, and control your environment more granularly that way. Think maybe I want to disallow the creation of an S3 bucket without encryption, or the creation of a user without MFA. These are examples of the types of policies that can be enforced at an organizational level, so that you don't have to worry about what that one dev team over in their one specific account forgot to turn on MFA. It's just, if you're part of the organization, it's automatically enforced. This capability becomes even more useful when you design your organization to carve out specific functionality for individual accounts. For instance, if your accounting department wants access to the billing and a roll-up of all the expenditures, but has no interest or need to access the actual application that is causing that billing to be generated, why not give them a dedicated account? That account could be configured to automatically aggregate the bills from all the other accounts under that root org, and uh, display them for analysis and settlement. Similarly, you could provision an account for security auditing or application log aggregation. Uh, we commonly set up resource utilization visualization, so you can have kind of a NOC or a SOC sitting in its own separate account. Um, or in the case that you have services that span multiple teams or business units, think like a CI/CD or infrastructure as code tooling, um, you can carve out an account specifically for those, so that they're segmented both logically and from an accounting perspective, and so that really there's no chance of the wrong person touching the wrong button and accidentally taking down production. So every business is different, and each environment in that business has its own needs. When you're building out your organizational hierarchy, you need to consider how your developers, your administrators, your different business teams are going to interact with the cloud services, and how data is going to flow through them. This is key. This will help you answer the obvious questions, like, should I have one account per app or one account per dev team? Maybe we only need one account per business unit. Ultimately, the answer is always going to be, it depends. It depends on how the app team, the dev team, how the specific application, how the dev team or how the business interacts with the data that's flowing in and out of that account and that entire organization. Uh, so really it depends, but regardless of the business case and the data flows, we generally find that these few ideas need to be enforced. That a few ideas need to be enforced. First, sandboxes are isolated. You want to keep those out of the main data flows. You don't want actual production data or anything potentially sensitive going through them. You want to keep your development and QA and testing environments as close to production as you possibly can. This is kind of a nice way to keep your house clean, but also ensure that when you're testing things, it's actually going to resemble what it's going to act like in production. And then finally, production should be the most tightly scoped, both from a data flow perspective, but also as from a security perspective as you can get it. This means limit access to only maybe the NOC, and maybe they only have read-only access, and then you have a break glass user who can go in there and troubleshoot things in the rare event that anything goes wrong in production.
And I did want to bring up a point here is we go into a lot of clients, especially clients that are growing rapidly, and they really hadn't had a strategy around this. And they may have individual accounts, just completely disparate accounts everywhere else. And when you start looking at it, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And we're going to go into another slide a little bit, or Aaron is, about that. But this generally doesn't happen as a decision initially. This just happens through the course of business as you grow. A new business unit may come in, or they have a new application, and suddenly you have a bunch of accounts, and it just organically grows by itself. And we see that all the time.
So as Greg was saying, a lot of times there's not forethought, and understandably so, put into building out the hierarchy of a more complex cloud environment. I like to think that a good rule of thumb is uh, your cloud organization should really resemble the business org in its hierarchy, right? Like we were saying earlier, dev teams need their accounts, accounting probably needs an account, DevOps or pipelines need accounts, and so on and so forth. It's not universally applicable, but I also like to take that one step further and say generally your cloud org should resemble your business, and even more generally, your business should probably resemble the data that your business runs off of. So if you're primarily focused on advertising or user experience on a website, that data should all funnel through very easily into your analytics, into your aggregation, and then back out so that you get paid. Somewhere along the cloud journey, you might find that there are exceptions to this, but I've always found it helps me keep the architecture only as complicated as is necessary to accomplish the business goal, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here.
And I just want to jump in on here because this is a key foundational control, is approaching your organization from some sort of plan. You need to have this design in place. And Aaron mentioned, I've seen customers come in basically saying, I want my organization to be by just prod, non-prod, maybe a staging breakdown there. I've had other units or companies I work with that have disparate business units, like Aaron's talking about, where it makes sense for each of them to go. This isn't a one size fits all. This is something that you need to make a conscious decision about how you're going to use it, billing's a big part of this, how you're going to bill. If you can aggregate everything to certain areas for billing, that's a big point too.
That's a great call out. And it should also be noted that in most cases, you're able to kind of plug and play accounts and to some degree the higher level organizational units within the various structures of your particular cloud environment or provider. That is to say that if you have a team that's gone off and created their own AWS account, and you now want to bring them in under a re-envisioned org that you're building, it's fairly trivial to just say, hey, I'm going to adopt that particular account. In fact, that's the exact parlance. I'm going to adopt this account, and it is now subject to the strictures and the rules that we put in place for the entire organization. Now, there's some caveats there with bringing in accounts that haven't previously been subjected. You need to be careful around edge cases where certain controls may not apply immediately or without direct interaction to those newly adopted accounts. But in general, there is a way to both add and remove accounts. So in the case that there's a merger or you sell off spin off a particular piece of the business, you can also remove them and send it on its way. And so naturally, one of the big questions we have is, well, when should I consider building out a separate root organization? And what we generally find is there's a number of valid reasons to have multiple roots, but there's also a lot of good reason to try not to, right? Probably the most common thing we see is products of mergers and acquisitions. So you either bought or you sell a portion of your business, and in bringing in or spinning out that business, you need to manipulate where data is and either, like I said, send it on its way or welcome it into the throes now. That's by far the most common thing we see that justifies having multiple roots. Ultimately, the goal should be let's finish the business side of the acquisition and then start integrating the cloud resources into a single organization, both for simplicity of billing, but also for simplicity of compliance and administration. The next two I kind of linked together. You're either under a regulatory or compliance regimen. You have data residency concerns, or you're working on highly sensitive projects in the case of, for instance, FedRAMP. So and I'll let Greg speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to run through a couple things here. So data residency, there are countries like China or other countries out there that do require you to keep their citizens' data in country. So at that point, especially in the cloud environment, you are going to have to create at least resources in a particular region. There are risks associated with that in certain places. And certain companies may decide that it's better to just direct or completely bifurcate or split out that part of the business as a separate account for legal reasons or for national defense or something like that. So those are one of the reasons to do a separate account. The other reasons listed here, FedRAMP as an example. So FedRAMP, if you are selling any sort of cloud service to the federal government, so anything that's not running on federal government machines is a cloud service for the most part. If you're going to sell a cloud service to the government, they are required by law to only purchase FedRAMP authorized products at that. So what you have to do is look at your commercial product and see if it's meeting the FedRAMP standards. 97% of the time, I'd say that we see people, their commercial product does not meet the high standards for FedRAMP. And so they have two solutions. One is to upgrade their commercial environment so that the FedRAMP standards are there, but that adds a lot of controls and costs. A lot of times we'll see them bifurcate that and have a separate account that they have their federal offering in, and it's a copy of the commercial, but there's a lot more controls around it. It may have less functionality just to meet the controls, and there's a lot more cost around continuous monitoring and everything else. So that may be a higher cost point that the government may pay for the security standard, but most of your commercial clients won't. You can do that with split accounts and doing separate accounts in the same org, or you can actually do it with separate routes. And I guess, Aaron, if you want to take that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I'll also make a nod to the last two items there. If you're reselling or have a multi-tenant or want to have an isolated tenant application, or if you think you need privileged sandboxes, um, it's definitely worth looking into whether or not you can accomplish the same level of security posture and compliance with native tooling, without building out a separate route. My rule of thumb is generally make sure that native IAM, just vanilla IAM, resource tagging, the native built-in data residency tooling, and just logical isolation at an account or a project level are not viable before committing to managing a separate route. There's definitely cases where you need to. Um, I'd say probably 50% of the time, unless you're specifically looking at FedRAMP, most of our customers don't fundamentally need a separate root organization. Right. So we've talked about kind of laying this hierarchy out. Let's talk about what we can actually enforce upon it. My personal favorite is MFA. Um, I carry a little YubiKey key on my keychain with me all the time, so I love plugging them in and pushing the button, and hey, I'm magically authenticated. Um, one of the first controls we generally apply in our customer environments, and generally what they need is multi-factor authentication, among other things. Um, Other highlights, you can dictate centralized audit logging and aggregation. You can mandate data encryption at rest in various cloud environments, and also mandate tagging. Tagging is a big one, both for accounting and cost analysis, but also for attribute-based access control. You can say you cannot spin up a compute instance without an owner tag and a cost allocation tag, um, so that you're guaranteed every instance running is accounted for and can be tied back to the cost center. But also, we know who we need to call when there's an incident to respond to, or if there's been a crypto jacking or something like that. We always know exactly who to go to say, hey, your instance is off the wheels or off the rails. We need to get it fixed. More generally, you can delegate any level of privilege that is accessible through the native IAM functionality at any level of the organizational hierarchy. You can manage service limits, and like I said, we keep coming back to cost management. FinOps is still pretty high on everybody's totem pole. So cost management is definitely something you can accomplish using these controls. You're probably thinking, wow, there's a lot here, and we haven't even gotten into the last two sections of the talk yet. I want to instill upon you that if it starts to feel too complicated, if you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is more than I can handle, or this is probably more than we should be handling, then trust your gut. It probably is getting too complicated, because a lot of these systems have been really well designed. They're pretty eloquent in the way you lay them out, and it shouldn't be a bowl of spaghetti when you're looking at your IAM. It should be very precise and very logical in the way that permissions fall through the various levels. But there are cases where it does get complicated and where it might, your particular use case might necessitate a little bit of bowl of spaghetti. But in general, keep it simple. It's probably supposed to be simple. And so to summarize, this is kind of the broadest section of the talk, but to summarize, design for scale early. You'll be better off in the long run, and it will enable you to do a lot more with fewer cloud resources. Um, focus primarily on how your data flows, where it flows, and who you want to be able to see it. And it's hard to go wrong if you're focusing on the data. You can certainly go off down rabbit holes with compliance and with user specific stuff, but if you're focusing on the data, you're probably not going to be caught off guard. And then finally, just remember that this org structure enables fine-grained control down the pipe. It doesn't actually do it, but it is required to be able to implement some of the other things we're going to talk about later on. All right, so we're going to talk about single sign-on now. So now that we've laid the foundation with a sound organizational structure, we need to talk. We want to see how we're actually going to be able to access that, and that the answer is single sign-on. But before we can talk about single sign-on, we should really probably define the term federation. I prefer the first line of AWS's documentation, and that states, identity federation is a system of trust between two parties for the purpose of authenticating users and conveying information needed to authorize their access to resources. That's a whole lot of big words. What does it mean in terms of the actual resources, though? We need a source of truth for the identity of the people who are trying to access these things, and then we need a protocol or possibly two to establish trust between that source of truth and the target resources, right? So we want to be able to say, point to the place in the logbook that says, okay, Greg's able to access the accounting data. Luckily, both of these concepts are widely established. If you've been in IT for any amount of time, you've probably come across infrastructure like this, either in the cloud or in legacy. And so the pieces are most likely already in place. You just need to implement them. So the great thing about federation is you're already doing, if you're already doing user identity from somewhere on the left, your identity provider, and I am somewhere on the right, it's relatively simple to glue these together using the protocols in the middle, OpenID and SAML 2.0. Obviously, each platform has their own implementation details, but generally, you're looking at telling your IDP to talk to your cloud resources via one of these protocols. And on top of that, now all the major cloud providers natively support SCIM 2.0, which keeps these user identities in sync automatically. This is a huge feature. It used to be a real pain, specifically on one of the platforms that I won't call out directly. But if you remember from the compliance slides earlier, every framework calls out the need for identity lifecycle management. This is critical. And on top of being critical to any compliance regimen, it's a real pain if you have to do it manually. It's a lot of man hours, a lot of toil, and it's very error prone. And with SCIM, any create, update, or delete operations in your IDP are automatically federated or automatically synchronized down through federation. It's also worth noting that you can take the concept of federation one layer deeper once your target cloud is talking to your IDP. Say, for instance, that you're running a tool that requires authentication, say Jenkins on an AWS instance. You can further configure Jenkins to authenticate based on the user identities that have been federated to Identity Center so that you only need to authenticate once back at your IDP. In our case at ScaleSec, we rely on Google Workspace for IDP. We have it federated into AWS single sign-on or AWS Identity Center, which allows us to single sign-on to sign on once through our Google identity, federate into our AWS account, and once we've federated into that AWS account, click one button and jump into whatever resources we have federated through SSO. I specifically set up this Jenkins SSO Google Workspace authorization chain with a customer a few months ago, and it was a really big improvement in the user experience for their engineers. They no longer had to manage 3 different layers of username and password, and the security team was even more happy because they could correlate actions done in Jenkins via those logs all the way back to their IDP source of truth in their IDP. So there's a ton of documentation on setting up any combination of these. I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader because we could sit here and talk for a week about all the different combinations.
What you're doing with Federation, and Aaron covered it very technically on there, but basically you're choosing a provider to be your golden source of your identities. Whether it's Okta, Enter ID, Workspace, it's one of those. You are basically saying you're going to be the golden source for all my identities. The thing I talk to most companies is each of these companies on here, Okta, Entra, or which is Microsoft or Google, they probably have more people working just on identity and specialists on identity than most companies have in their entire IT department. So having this moved over to these companies is not as big as a risk as you think it is because they actually expertise in it. Now you can set it up incorrectly or do other things that may make it riskier, but having a central source run by a company that focuses on that is generally an ideal solution for most companies, unless you're just super large or super regulated or in the government on there. And even the government uses these. So that's just something to think about when you go into Federation is choose one, choose wisely. It is a pain to move between them. So you really want to do your research ahead of time, but choose wisely and then focus on doing the integrations.
First and foremost, if you have a directory, you can almost certainly federate. They've been doing federation with Active Directory, legacy Active Directory since I think there was Active Directory. So there's probably no excuse, no technical excuse as to why you can't federate. Now, if you can federate, which, like we just said, you most certainly can, you absolutely should federate. Um, the the gains in both user experience and loss of administrative overhead far outweigh any effort that needs to be put in to synchronize it. And especially with the addition of automatic synchronization, which is native to most platforms now, it's really a no-brainer. It's important to remember that federation is only really a quarter of the battle, right? It's only a small piece of the pie. Once you've got federation set up, you need to redirect a lot of that energy that you might have spent on identity lifecycle management and user provisioning and stuff towards IAM specifically, because only there begins the true journey, which is developing an IAM posture that applies least privilege to your entire environment. Now, I'm sure you've probably all been waiting for this section. That this is the kind of the demo and the example section. We could really sit here and talk for a week about each cloud provider's IAM functionality individually. I want to leave you though with a few concepts, with three core concepts that'll kind of be a guiding light as you go down the path of developing IAM for a larger environment. And those are role-based authentication, attribute-based authentication, and policy-based authentication. These are functionalities supported natively in all three of the major cloud providers, IAM implementations. And so I'm going to give you a quick example to kind of whet your appetite, and then I'll leave it as an exercise for the viewer to go forth with this new knowledge and search the documents. So this is, and again, these are all pulled directly from the respective cloud provider documentations. What we've got here is a role-based access role, which would be applied to a user in Azure. It's specifically a custom role. It applies to a specific set of scopes. In this case, it's a two individual subscriptions or accounts in Azure, along with a mid-level management group. There's some metadata, some description and stuff there. And then there's a block right in the middle that lays out all the permissions. Now, something really cool to call out here is that there's both an allow and a deny data access. I'm not going to get into the latter part, but what you're seeing here is specifically outlining the very granular details with which this policy will allow the individual assigned to it to access specific data. In this case, it allows you to monitor, this particular policy allows you to monitor and manage a VM instance. Moving on to GCP, This is an example of an attribute-based access control policy. Here, we're restricting creation of resources based on the location specified in the resources and in the resource tag. So an attribute is some inherent information about a particular resource. So maybe it's a tag, maybe it's a type, maybe it's a location. In this case, we're saying we don't want you to be able to spin up an instance in a particular region in a data center in a particular region, right? And that's very important for data sovereignty and residency compliance. And there's obviously all kinds of different attributes you could reference here, and different combinations of attributes and conditions that you might want to apply to your specific use case. So, and finally, last but not least, here's a policy-based access control example from AWS. So the top half of this is a pretty bone standard access policy for a simple queuing service queue that would allow the sending and receiving of messages by a particular principal, in this case an AWS account, to a particular specified queue there in the resource definition about midway down. Now, just below that resource definition is a condition block, and this is where things get really interesting. This is a very simple condition. Again, I spent an entire day just going over the specific conditions that you can apply to an AWS policy, and it took us the entire day and then some after happy hour. But this is like I said, this is a very simple condition whereby we're saying the above policy is only applicable for, in this case, a very short 3-hour period back in 2014. So you see down there, the condition is that the data is greater than or less than, and the specific current time there in Zulu time. So effectively, if you missed that, I think this was probably an early Taylor Swift concert. If you weren't able to get your message in there for tickets, you missed out. So again, these are all simple examples. These are all very high level examples, but still very applicable. I implore you go check out the documentation. There are tomes about how you can do what you can do and how you can do it across all the different clouds. And it would be futile to try and even chip off the tip of that iceberg in just a 45-minute presentation.
And thank you for dropping Taylor Swift in there. So that should help on our search and optimization later. But we want to thank Schellman for having us out for this particular talk. We do have our website, scalesec.com, or you can email us. There's a phone number on there. We're going to be available for Q&A. We're going to have a booth as well, so you can reach out to us in our booth, and we'll either answer you immediately at the booth or get the right person for you to talk to. So with that said, we're going to stop here and move into Q&A. So thank you everybody for your time, and we will talk to you one-on-one.